All right, well, welcome everyone to this first session of Travels with Charley. I will be your guide to this book. I read this book a couple times each year because I teach it for different colleges, universities, and residents like you all are at. I love this book. It's kind of, I was raised with standard poodles because my mom was allergic to pretty much everything else. So this became kind of our family book. And another reason why I think it's a great choice for now is because it begins at about this time and it extends throughout the fall. And so we'll kind of journey along with Steinbeck as he goes into the autumn season, and it'll kind of match our own seasonal affections and ambiance where we are as well. I am in Richmond, Virginia. I used to live in Redmond, Washington, and teach at the University of Washington and at Lake Washington Institute of Technology, but I got a fellowship to a seminary here to write a book on Thomas Merton. So I am here for 10 months because they have an amazing library right across the street. I'm also living in one of their townhouses, me and my wife. So and I'm also much closer to my family, who I hadn't seen for 2 years due to COVID, who live in New Jersey. So I am 2,850 miles away. But due to this technology that we're in, which Steinbeck did not have when he went on his trip with his dog, Charley, I can be present with you here and you being there. So the book I use is the 50th anniversary edition, which has an excellent introduction by Jay Perini, who's a writer. And I'm going to read you just 2 things from that introduction to kind of give you context to the book. So he says, Travels with Charley in Search of America, originally published in 1962, is the final and most satisfying of his travelogues, summoning a complex vision of the United States at the beginning of a tumultuous decade, when race relations in particular had reached a point where the old ways could no longer remain in place. It is the work of a mature writer at the end of a long writing life, and it serves as a kind of elegy for a world that had already been lost. It is also a fascinating memoir, the self-portrait of a very private man who did not much take to explicit autobiography. Indeed, it would be a mistake to take this travelogue too literally, as Steinbeck was at heart a novelist, and he added countless touches to the book. And that's something I'm going to talk to you about. This is supposed to be a work of creative nonfiction. I'll explain what that means in a second, because he kind of violated the ethics of that. And then the other part I wanted to read is the journey described in Travels with Charley might be considered a classic example of the hero's journey, the archetypal myth that lends an essential structure to so much narrative literature. Joseph Campbell, the famous mythologist, wrote a book called The Hero's Journey. In the traditional myth, a hero, whoever they might be, abandons their safe haven and pushes forward into the wilderness or depths in order to test themselves against the odds. In the course of this testing, they either discover their own rich resources or come into contact with higher powers that assist them. The story inevitably involves a returning, which completes the cycle. The point being that upon returning, the hero has been immeasurably strengthened by the knowledge gained in the course of their difficult journey. Of course, the Odyssey, the journey of Odysseus, is one of the classic myths of the hero's journey. But just to get back to the idea of creative nonfiction, which is the genre that all my books, except for my poetry books, are published in, creative nonfiction. And Steinbeck kind of violates that in this. So in creative nonfiction, you're combining the beautiful descriptive elements of creative writing with nonfiction, events that actually happen, right? Fiction, you can make up whatever you want, but in nonfiction, they have to happen. But there's a rule in creative nonfiction that you cannot embellish, change, or make up anything to make the book more interesting. Steinbeck did not actually follow that to the T because he is a novelist at heart, and so he interjected things and made up some dialogue and characters that actually later on we found out weren't actually there. However, true to the idea of a myth is something that is ultimately true even if it didn't take place in reality. So along with that definition of myth, we can accept Steinbeck's account of this and just kind of travel along and indulge his novelist pretensions. All right. So part one is very interesting. We're going to spend a bit of time on that today because a lot of people, especially my students, ask why part one was even in the book, because it's his preparation for the journey. And a lot of people are like, let's just get going. However, I love part one because it says a lot about Steinbeck and about what he was going through as a human being at that time and why he wanted to go on this journey. And we learn that by him putting in part one. And an amazing writer like Steinbeck, who won the Pulitzer Prize, the Nobel Prize for Literature, doesn't put something in a book unless there's a real reason why he wants to include it. Part one. When I was very young and the urge to be someplace else was on me, I was assured by mature people that maturity would cure this itch. When years described me as mature, the remedy prescribed was middle age. In middle age, I was assured that greater age would calm my fever, and now that I am 58, perhaps senility will do the job. Nothing has worked. 4 hoarse blasts of a ship's whistle still raised the hair on my neck and set my feet to tapping. Steinbeck had been in the Navy, so that's a Navy kind of thing there. The sound of a jet, an engine warming up, and even the clopping of shod hooves on pavement brings on the ancient shudder, the dry mouth and vacant eye, the hot palms and the churn of stomach high up under the rib cage. In other words, I don't improve. In further words, once a bum, always a bum. I fear the disease is incurable. I set this matter down not to instruct others, but to inform myself. When the virus of restlessness begins to take possession of a wayward man, and the road away from here seems broad and straight and sweet, the victim must first find in himself a good and sufficient reason for going. This, to the practical bum, is not difficult. He has a built-in garden of reasons to choose from. Next, he must plan his trip in time and space, choose a direction and a destination. And last, he must implement the journey. How to go, what to take, and how long to stay. This part of the process is invariable and immortal. I set it down only so that newcomers to bumdom, like teenagers in new hatched sin, will not think they invented it. Once a journey is designed, equipped, and put in process, a new factor enters and takes over. A trip, a safari, an exploration is an entity, different from all other journeys. It has personality, temperament, individuality, and uniqueness. A journey is a person in itself. No two are alike. And all plans, safeguards, policing, and coercion are fruitless. We find after years of struggle that we do not take a trip takes us. Tour masters, schedules, reservations, brass-bound and inevitable, dash themselves to wreckage on the personality of the trip. Only when this is recognized can the blown in the glass bum relax and go along with it. Only then do the frustrations fall away. In this, a journey is like marriage. The certain way to be wrong is to think you control it. I feel better now having said this, although only those who have experienced it will understand it. And so, interestingly enough, Steinbeck's wife, this was her favorite book of his because she felt it was the first time that he had ever really let his guard down. And the fact that he took Charley along with him as a companion really gave him kind of what we call a literary device. And a literary device is what the author uses to progress the narrative. So there's a few things that Steinbeck uses in this. 1 is the trip itself. 2 is his dog, Charley. And 3 is his truck, Rocinante, which he named after Don Quixote's horse. And so you'll see that he relates to these literary devices often whenever he needs to keep the narrative going or get unstuck in his writing. And it works beautifully. Like my students always say whenever Charley disappears for a while, they're always like, when is Charley going to come back into the story? Because people grow very fond of this French poodle. So this is still part one. That was the first part of part one. And some of the questions, my book is annotated, so I write all over it so that I can foster discussion. But some of the questions I ask my students before we read this next part is, what is America? And when is your America? So what is America and when is your America? My plan was clear, concise, and reasonable, I think. For many years, I have traveled in many parts of the world. In America, I live in New York, or dip into Chicago or San Francisco. But New York is no more America than Paris is France or London is England. Thus, I discovered that I did not know my own country. I, an American writer writing about America, was working from memory. And the memory is at best a faulty, warpy reservoir. I had not heard the speech of America, smelled the grass and trees and sewage, seen its hills and water, its color and quality of light. I knew the changes only from books and newspapers, but more than this, I had not felt the country for 25 years. In short, I was writing of something I did not know about, and it seems to me that in a so-called writer, this is criminal. My memories were distorted by 25 intervening years. Once, I traveled about in an old bakery wagon, double-doored rattler with a mattress on its floor. I stopped where people stopped or gathered. I listened and looked and felt, and in the process had a picture of my country, the accuracy of which was inspired only by my own shortcomings. So it was that I determined to look again, to try to rediscover this monster land. Otherwise, in writing, I could not tell the small diagnostic truths which are the foundations of the larger truth. One sharp difficulty presented itself. In the intervening 25 years, my name had become reasonably well known. And it has been my experience that when people have heard of you, favorably or not, they change. They become, through shyness or the other qualities that publicity inspires, something they are not under ordinary circumstances. This being so, my trip demanded that I leave my name and my identity at home. I had to be peripatetic eyes and ears, a kind of moving gelatin plate. I could not sign hotel registers, meet people I knew, interview others, or even ask searching questions. Furthermore, 2 or more people disturbed the ecologic complex of an area. I had to go alone, and I had to be self-contained, a kind of casual turtle carrying his house on his back. With all this in mind, I wrote to the head office of a great corporation which manufactures trucks. I specified my purpose and my needs. I wanted a 3/4-ton pickup truck capable of going anywhere under possibly rigorous conditions. And on this truck, I wanted a little house built like the cabin of a small boat. So as we see, even though Steinbeck earlier says he's a bum, most bums could not afford to make their own house on wheels and take it with them like a very, let's say, rich turtle. A trailer is difficult to maneuver on mountain roads, is impossible and often illegal to park, and is subject to many restrictions. That is why I did not ask for a trailer, but in due time, specifications came through for a tough, fast, comfortable vehicle mounting a camper top, a little house with double bed, a 4-burner stove, a heater, refrigerator, and lights operating on butane, a chemical toilet, closet space, storage space, windows screened against insects. Exactly what I wanted. Actually, I think his abode is bigger than my place here that the seminary gave me and my wife, but It was delivered in the summer to my little fishing place at Sag Harbor near the end of Long Island. Although I didn't want to start before Labor Day, when the nation settles back to normal living, I did want to get used to my turtle shell, to equip it and learn it. It arrived in August, a beautiful thing, powerful and yet lithe. It was almost as easy to handle as a passenger car. And because my planned trip had aroused some satiric remarks among my friends, I named it Rocinante, which you will remember was the name of Don Quixote's horse. Since I made no secret of my project, a number of controversies arose among my friends and advisors. I was told that since my photograph was as widely distributed as my publisher could make it, I would find it impossible to move about without being recognized. Let me say in advance that in over 10,000 miles, in 34 states, I was not recognized even once. I believe that people identify things only in context. Even those people who might have known me against the background I am supposed to have, in no case identified me in Rocinante. I was advised that the name Rocinante, painted on the side of my truck in 16th century Spanish script, would cause curiosity and inquiry in some places. I do not know how many people recognize the name, but surely no one ever asked me about it. Next, I was told that a stranger's purpose in moving about the country might cause inquiry or even suspicion. For this reason, I racked a shotgun, 2 rifles, and a couple of fishing rods in my truck. For it is my experience that if a man is going hunting or fishing, his purpose is understood and even applauded. Actually, my hunting days are over. I no longer kill or catch anything I cannot get into a frying pan. I am too old for sport killing. This stage setting turned out to be also unnecessary. It was said that my New York license plates would arouse interest and perhaps questions, since they were the only outward identifying marks I had. And so they did, perhaps 20 or 30 times in the whole trip. But such contacts followed an invariable pattern, somewhat as follows. Local man. New York, huh? Me. Yep. Local man. I was there in 1938, or was it 39? Alice, was it 38 or 39? We went to New York. Alice, it was 36. I remember because it was the year Alfred died. Local man. Anyway, I hated it. Wouldn't live there if you paid me. There was some genuine worry about my traveling alone, being open to attack, robbery, assault. It is well known that our roads are dangerous. And here I admit I had senseless qualms. It is some years since I have been alone, nameless, friendless, without any of the safety one gets from family, friends, and accomplices. There is no reality in the danger. It's just a very lonely, helpless feeling at first, a kind of desolate feeling. For this reason, I took one companion on my journey, an old French gentleman poodle known as Charley. Actually, his name is Charles Le Chien. He was born in Bercy on the outskirts of Paris and trained in France. And while he knows a little poodle English, he responds quickly only to commands in French. The dog is bilingual, people. He's ahead of where I am. Otherwise, he has to translate, and that slows him down. He is a very big poodle of a color called bleu, and he is bleu when he is clean. Charley is a born diplomat. He prefers negotiating to fighting, and properly so, since he is very bad at fighting. Only once in his 10 years has he been in trouble, when he met a dog who refused to negotiate with him. Charley lost a piece of his right ear that time, but he is a good watchdog, has a roar like a lion, designed to conceal from night-wandering strangers the fact that he couldn't bite his way out of a cornet de papier, or a paper bag. He is a good friend and traveling companion, and would rather travel about than anything he can imagine. If he occurs at length in this account, it is because he contributed much to the trip. A dog, particularly an exotic like Charley, is a bond between strangers. Many conversations en route began with, quote, "What degree of a dog is that?" The techniques of opening conversation are universal. I knew long ago and rediscovered that the best way to attract attention, help, and conversation is to be lost. A man who, seeing his mother starving to death on a path, kicks her in the stomach to clear the way, will cheerfully devote several hours of his time giving wrong directions to a total stranger who claims to be lost. There's a very interesting metaphor about his mother, but gets the point across. So are there any questions or thoughts as we're moving through part one? Now he's going to bring us into where he lives in Sag Harbor, Long Island. But all of that part of point one up to this point was allowing him to kind of get intimate with the reader about why he's doing this, what his state of mind is, what his preparation is. And he's getting us kind of to trust him. And one of the things I always tell my students is if you're going to go on a 200, 300, 400-page journey with an author, you want to get to trust them and you want to get to know the inner workings of their mind. I was in Malaysia one time and this girl who I was staying at a hostel, and she had a book that she had just finished, and she's like, "Hey Jake, do you want to read this book?" And I looked at it and the book was this big. It was 1,400 pages. And I said, "I don't think so." And she said, "No, really, it's very interesting." And I picked that book up and I read it in 3 days because I just loved the narrator and trusted the narrator, even though he was a criminal, and to bring me into that book. And in the same way, we have to learn to trust the narrator. And that's what Steinbeck is doing at this point. So any thoughts, questions, musings? Revolts at not getting actual coffee or tea, but just metaphorical coffee and tea? Anything?
Here comes the music.
In 1988, this was my husband's favorite book. And in 1988, we took off on 12,000 miles for a year, and I was his Charley. It was a fabulous, and I'm laughing already as I read this book, the memory of it.
Did you catch that?
I did.
Okay, good. Anyone
Husband's
else?
favorite book, she was the Charley.
Okay, I think we're ready to carry on.
Okay, yeah. So let's continue on, but now we're going to go to where he lives, which is Sag Harbor, Long Island, and this is where he's going to take off from. So he's going to get more into kind of the psychological and emotional reasons for the trip. Under the big oak trees of my place at Sag Harbor sat Rocinante, handsome and self-contained, and neighbors came to visit. Some neighbors we didn't even know we had. I saw in their eyes something I was to see over and over in every part of the nation, a burning desire to go, to move, to get underway, any place, away from any here. They spoke quietly of how they wanted to go someday, to move about free and unanchored, not towards something, but away from something. I saw this look and heard this yearning everywhere in every state I visited. Nearly every American hungers to move. One small boy, about 13 years old, came back every day. He stood apart shyly and looked at Rocinante. He peered in the door, even lay on the ground and studied the heavy-duty springs. He was a silent, ubiquitous small boy. He even came back at night to stare at Rocinante. After a week, he could stand it no longer. His words wrestled their way hell-bent through his shyness. He said, quote, "If you'll take me with you, why, I'll do anything. I'll cook, I'll wash all the dishes, and I'll do all the work, and I'll even take care of you." Unfortunately for me, I knew his longing. "I wish I could," I said, "but the school board and your parents and lots of others say I can't." "I'll do anything," he said, and I believe he would. I don't think he ever gave up until I drove away without him. He had the dream I've had all my life, and there is no cure. Equipping Rocinante was a long and pleasant process. I took far too many things, but I didn't know what I would find. Tools for emergency, tow lines, a small block and tackle, a trenching tool and crowbar, tools for making and fixing and improvising. Then there were emergency foods, and I would be late in the Northwest and caught by snow. I prepared for at least a week of emergency. Water was easy. Rocinante carried a 30-gallon tank. I thought I might do some writing along the way, perhaps essays, surely notes, certainly letters. I took paper, carbon, At this point, my students go, "What's carbon?" Typewriter, pencils, notebooks, and not only those, but dictionaries. Of course, they don't know what a dictionary is either. A compact encyclopedia and a dozen other reference books, heavy ones. I suppose our capacity for self-delusion is boundless. I knew very well that I rarely make notes, and if I do, I either lose them or can't read them. I also knew from 30 years of my profession that I cannot write hot on an event. Writing hot means spontaneous in the moment, which is pretty much the way that I write. And then I go back later on, but he doesn't write like that at all. He can't write in the moment. He has to take it all in, digest, and then write later. It has to ferment. I must do what a friend calls, quote, mule it over. And no, he doesn't say mull, mule it over, for a time before it goes down. And in spite of this self-knowledge, I equipped Rocinante with enough writing material to take care of 10 volumes. Also, I laid in 150 pounds of those books one hasn't got around to reading. And of course, those are the books one isn't ever going to get around to reading. Canned goods, shotgun shells, rifle cartridges, toolboxes, and far too many clothes, blankets, and pillows, and many too many shoes and boots, padded nylon sub-zero underwear, plastic dishes and cups, and a plastic dishpan, a spare tank of bottled gas. The overloaded springs sighed and settled lower and lower. I judged now that I carried about 4 times too much of everything. Now, Charley is a mind-reading dog. There have been many trips in his lifetime, and often he has to be left at home. He knows we are going long before the suitcases come out, and he paces and worries and whines and goes into a state of mild hysteria, old as he is. If you ever want to read an actual study on this, Rupert Sheldrake from England does a great study on how dogs know that their masters are coming home, even when they're miles and miles away. Labor Day approached, the day of truth when millions of kids would be back in school and tens of millions of parents would be off the highways. I was prepared to set out as soon after that as possible. And about that time, Hurricane Donna was reported tromping her way out of the Caribbean in our direction. On Long Island's tip, we have had enough of that to be highly respectful. With a hurricane approaching, we prepare to stand a siege. Our little bay is fairly well protected, but not that well. As Donna crept toward us, I filled the kerosene lamps, activated the hand pump to the well, and tied down everything movable. I have a 22-foot cabin boat, the Fair Elaine. I battened her down and took her to the middle of the bay, put down a huge old-fashioned hook anchor and half-inch chain, and moored her with a long swing. With that rig, she could ride a 150-mile wind unless her bow pulled out. And again, Seinfeld had been in the Navy. He was very familiar with boats and tying knots and everything. Donna sneaked on. We brought out a battery radio for reports, since the power would go off if Donna struck. But there was one added worry. Rocinante, sitting among the trees. In a waking nightmare, I saw a tree crash down on the truck and crush her like a bug. I placed her away from a possible direct fall, but that didn't mean that the whole top of the tree might not fly 50 feet through the air and smash her. By early morning, we knew by radio that we were going to get it. And by 10 o'clock, we heard that the eye of the storm would pass over us and that it would reach us at 1:07, some exact time like that. Our bay was quiet, without a ripple, but the water was still dark and the Fair Elaine rode daintily slack against her mooring. Our bay is better protected than most, so that many small craft came cruising in for their mooring. And I saw with fear that many of their owners did not know how to moor. Finally, 2 boats, pretty things, came in, one towing the other. A light anchor went down and they were left. The bow of one tethered to the stern of the other, and both within the swing of the Fair Elaine. I took a megaphone to the end of my pier and tried to protest against this foolishness, but the owners either did not hear or did not know or did not care. The wind struck And so I want to go to that. There's a lot of metaphors in this book for the changing tides of America. So America is really changing in the 60s, and Steinbeck has lived in an America that is now beginning to change. And so kind of this whole series here, new boats coming into the harbor, his, old, boat that he's loved, moored safely in the harbor. There's all these metaphors about the change that's occurring in the United States. And even the megaphone, him protesting, his voice not really reaching anybody as this change is just sweeping through the country. So there's all these great metaphorical, realistic and metaphorical images in there that take us into his inner psychological state. The wind struck on the moment we were told that it would and ripped the water like a black sheet. It hammered like a fist. The whole top of an oak tree crashed down, grazing the cottage where we watched. The next gust stove one of the big windows in. I forced it back and drove wedges in top and bottom with a hand axe. Electric power and telephones went out with the first blast as we knew they must. And 8-foot tides were predicted. We watched the wind rip at earth and sea like a surging pack of terriers. The trees plunged and bent like grasses, and the whipped water raised a cream of foam. A boat broke loose and tobogganed up on the shore, and then another. Houses built in the benign spring and early summer took waves in their second-story windows. Our cottage is on a little hill 30 feet above sea level, but the rising tide washed over my high pier. As the wind changed direction, I moved Rocinante to keep her always to leeward of our big oaks. The fair Elaine rode gallantly, swinging like a weather vane away from the changing wind. The boats, which had been tethered one onto the other, had fouled up by now, the tow line under propeller and rudder and the two hulls bashing and scraping together. Another craft had dragged its anchor and gone ashore on a mud bank. Charley dog has no nerves. Gunfire or thunder, explosions or high winds leave him utterly unconcerned. In the midst of the howling storm, he found a warm place under a table and went to sleep. The wind stopped as suddenly as it had begun, and although the waves continued out of rhythm, they were not wind-tattered, and the tide rose higher and higher. All the piers around our little bay had disappeared underwater, and only their piles or handrails showed. The silence was like a rushing sound. The radio told us we were now in the eye of Donna, the still and frightening calm in the middle of the revolving storm. I don't know how long the calm lasted. It seemed a long time of waiting. And then the other side struck us, the wind from the opposite direction. The fair Elaine swung sweetly around and put her bow into the wind, but the two lashed boats dragged anchor and swarmed down on fair Elaine and bracketed her. She was dragged, fighting and protesting downwind and forced against a neighboring pier, and we could hear her hull crying against the oaken piles. The wind registered over 95 miles now. I found myself running, fighting the wind around the head of the bay toward the pier where the boats were breaking up. I think my wife, for whom the fair Elaine is named, ran after me, shouting orders for me to stop. The floor of the pier was 4 feet underwater, but piles stuck up and offered handholds. I worked my way out little by little up to my breast pockets, the shore-driven wind slapping water in my mouth. My boat cried and whined against the piles and plunged like a frightened calf. Then I jumped and fumbled my way aboard her. For the first time in my life, I had a knife when I needed it. The bracketing, wayward boats were pushing Elaine against the pier. I cut anchor line and tow line and kicked them free, and they blew ashore on the mud bank. But Elaine's anchor chain was intact, and that great old mud hook was still down, 100 pounds of iron with spear-shaped flukes wide as a shovel. Elaine's engine is not always obedient, but this day it started at a touch. I hung on, standing on the deck, reaching inboard for wheel and throttle and clutch with my left hand, and that boat tried to help. I suppose she was that scared. I edged her out and worked up the anchor chain with my right hand. Under ordinary conditions, I can barely pull that anchor with both hands in a calm, but everything went right this time. I edged over the hook and it tipped up and freed its spades. Then I lifted it clear of the bottom and nosed into the wind and gave it throttle, and we headed into that goddamn wind and gained on it. It was as though we pushed our way through thick porridge. 100 yards offshore, I let the hook go, and it plunged down and grabbed bottom. And the fair Elaine straightened and raised her bow and seemed to sigh with relief. Well, there I was, 100 yards offshore with Donna baying over me like a pack of white-whiskered hounds. No skiff could possibly weather it for a minute. I saw a piece of branch go skidding by and simply jumped in after it. There was no danger. If I could keep my head up, I had to blow ashore, but I admit the half Wellington rubber boots I wore got pretty heavy. It couldn't have been more than 3 minutes before I grounded, and that other fair Elaine and a neighbor pulled me out. It was only then that I began to shake all over, but looking out and seeing our little boat riding well and safely was nice. I must have strained something pulling that anchor with one hand, because I needed a little help home. A tumbler of whiskey on the kitchen table was some help too. I've tried since to raise that anchor with one hand, and I can't ever do it. The wind died quickly and left us to wreckage, power lines down, and no telephone for a week. But Rocinante was not damaged at all. So that's the end of part 1. And another interesting metaphorical thing about that is people say, why would he really risk his life to go out and save that boat? But one way of looking at it from a depth psychology kind of perspective is that the boat represented his wife. It actually was named for her. And by securing that boat and making all of these provisions before he left, he felt like he was securing his wife before he left as well. And I've done some studies on his wife and her interviews that she's had about this book, and I think that's pretty right on to her kind of feelings about that as well. He needed to do this, but he also wanted to make provision for his wife to be as safe as possible as well. So any thoughts, questions about part 1? As a lot of my students don't, question why it's in there, I think it makes perfect sense. And as a reader, I like that he led us into his life before the trip, because it gives me even more context and intimacy with him as a writer as we're gonna now depart. But any thoughts or questions that any of you have out there in the audience?
How old was he? How old was he when he started this journey?
How old was he? I believe it says that he was 58 when he began this. Yeah. And one of the reasons that he really wanted to take the trip at this time was because it was right during and before the election of Nixon and Kennedy. And he felt that traveling during that time, he would be within a lot of conversations about the election. But it turned out that it almost never came up throughout the whole book, except when he went to visit his family, who were all Republicans, and he had become a Democrat, and they argued vociferously. So the only time that it actually came up was at their arguments at family dinners when he was meeting with his, I believe it was his sister who lived in a part of Texas now. And at the family dinner for Thanksgiving, they just screamed at each other.
Mm-hmm.
Would you please repeat the name of that book about the dogs? You said it quickly and I didn't get it down quick enough. The book about how they sense that the master's coming home at some time or leaving. Groovy?
It was, no. So I only know this because I used to lead retreats at a place in Canada, and this guy was there at that time, but he's pretty famous now. His name is Rupert Sheldrake. And I don't know the exact name of the book. I just know people who have attended some of his retreats and stuff who said that he did research on that, that kind of innate intuitive ability of a dog to understand when their master was coming home, even when they were many, many miles away.
Thank you.
I just want to break in and say, welcome back to Seattle. And I also wanted to say, anyone on Zoom, there are people Zooming from their apartments and other places. You're welcome to ask questions too. I have not muted anyone, so feel free to speak up if you have any questions, comments, anything you want to share.
Yeah, it's a good point. Anybody on Zoom have any thoughts or comments or questions?
I have a question about the 1,400-page book you read in 3 days. I'm wondering what it was.
It was called Shantavarnam, and it's about a Australian criminal who escapes from a prison in Australia and finds his way to India and hides in like the untouchable, city part of the city, and then actually becomes a Bollywood actor and stuntman. Then gets recaptured, goes to prison, writes the first draft of this book on toilet paper over several years. The guards catch him, destroy it, and he rewrites it on toilet paper over several years. And this is all true. It's a fascinating book.
Does it start with C or S?
S.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
And I'm not one to read long books, but it was like the perfect place too. I was in a kind of seedy city in Malaysia called Malacca. So I would go to like bars at night in the seedy part of the city and just read this book. And it was like the perfect geographical place to read this book by this guy. So.
Okay.
All right. Any other thoughts or questions before we start on part 2, which we won't make it through the whole part 2 because we have about 20 minutes left, but.
This is Cindy Mish, and I don't have my picture up there, but I just joined it on a last minute thing. So thank you for doing this. I am so, because of the whole isolation we've been in and not being able to be out on road trips, and I usually do a couple a year, and I'm just getting so antsy to get out there, and this is a good antidote to help me get through this antsy feeling I've been having. And I listened to it on audio about 6 months ago, Travels with Charley, but I'm gonna get a regular book paperback and get with it again and join this conversation, because Steinbeck's just one of a kind, and the whole book is very special. And thank you again for having this. It's really going to be fun to do. Thanks.
Yeah. And, I love, like I said, I read this book several times in a year because of teaching classes like this. And every time I read it, like, new stuff comes out. And that's what happens with a really good book. No matter how many times you read it, you always learn something new. You're always surprised by the beauty of the language or the description, or so. Yeah, it always gets, deeper every time I read it. All right, part 2. In long range planning for a trip, I think there is a private conviction that it won't happen. As the day approached, my warm bed and comfortable house grew increasingly desirable, and my dear wife incalculably precious. To give these up for 3 months for the terrors of the uncomfortable and unknown seemed crazy. I didn't want to go. Something had to happen to forbid my going, but it didn't. I could get sick, of course, but that was one of the main but secret reasons for going at all. During the previous winter, I had become rather seriously ill with one of those carefully named difficulties, which are the whispers of approaching age. When I came out of it, I received the usual lecture about slowing up, losing weight, limiting the cholesterol intake. It happens to many men, and I think doctors have memorized the litany. It had happened to so many of my friends. The lecture ends, slow down, you're not as young as you once were. And I had seen so many begin to pack their lives in cotton wool, smother their impulses, hood their passions, and gradually retire from their manhood into a kind of spiritual and physical semi-invalidism. In this, they are encouraged by wives and relatives, and it's such a sweet trap. Who doesn't like to be a center for concern? A kind of second childhood falls on us, and we trade our violence for the promise of a small increase of lifespan. And I have searched myself for this possibility with a kind of horror, for I have always lived violently, drunk hugely, eaten too much or not at all, slept around the clock or missed 2 nights of sleeping, worked too hard and too long in glory, or slobbed for a time in utter laziness. I have lifted, pulled, chopped, climbed, made love with joy, and taken my hangovers as a consequence, not as a punishment. I did not want to surrender fierceness for a small gain in yardage. I am not willing to trade quality for quantity. If this projected journey should prove too much, then it was time to go anyway. I see too many delay their exits with a sickly, slow reluctance to leave the stage. It's bad theater. The morning came, a bright one with the tawny look of autumn in the sunlight. My wife and I parted very quickly, since both of us hate goodbyes, and neither one of us wanted to be left when the other had gone. She gunned her motor and exploded away for New York, and I, with Charley beside me, drove Rocinante to the Shelter Island ferry, and then to a second ferry to Greenport, and then a third from Orient Point to the coast of Connecticut across Long Island Sound, for I wanted to avoid New York traffic and get well on my way. And I confess to a feeling of gray desolation. On the ferry deck, the sun was sharp and the coast of the mainland only an hour away. A lovely sloop stood away from us, her Genoa set like a curving scarf, and all the coastal craft trudged up the sound or wallowed heavily toward New York. Then a submarine slipped to the surface half a mile away, and the day lost part of its brightness. Farther away, another dark creature slashed through the water, and another. Of course, they are based in New London, and this is their home, and perhaps they are keeping the world's peace with this venom. I wish I could like submarines, for then I might find them beautiful, but they are designed for destruction. And while they may explore and chart the sea bottom and draw new trade lines under the Arctic ice, their main purpose is a threat. And I remember too well crossing the Atlantic on a troop ship and knowing that somewhere on the way, the dark things lurked searching for us with their single stalk eyes. Somehow the light goes bleak for me when I see them and remember burned men pulled from the oil-slicked sea. And now submarines are armed with mass murder, our silly only way of deterring mass murder. So again, there's a lot of things that he puts in from his time being in the Navy and the things that he saw that surfaced back up here. Only a few people stood in the wind on the top deck of the clanking iron ferry boat. A young man in a trench coat with corn silk hair and delphinium eyes, red-edged by the dull wind, turned to me and then pointed. "That's the new one," he said. "She can stay down 3 months." "How can you tell them?" "I know them. I'm on them." "Are they atomic?" "Not yet, but I've got an uncle on one, and maybe pretty soon." "You're not in uniform," I said. "Just had to leave. Do you like to serve on them?" "Sure I do. The pay is good and there's all kinds of future." "Would you like to be down 3 months?" I asked. "You'd get used to it. The food's good and there's movies and I'd like to go under the pole, wouldn't you?" "I guess I would," I replied. "And there's movies and all kinds of future." "Where are you from?" I asked. "From over there, New London, born there. My uncle's in the service and 2 cousins. I guess we're a kind of submarine family." "Well, they worry me," I said. "Oh, you'd get over that, sir. Pretty soon you wouldn't even think you were submerged. That is, if you haven't got something wrong with you. Ever had claustrophobia?" "No." "Well, then you soon get used to it. Care to go below for a cup of coffee? There's plenty of time." "Sure I would," I replied. And could be he's right and I'm wrong. It's his world, not mine anymore. There's no anger in his delphinium eyes and no fear and no hatred either. So Maybe it's all right. It's just a job with good pay and a future. I must not put my memories and my fears on him. Maybe it won't be true again, but that's his lookout. It's his world now, and perhaps he understands things that I will never learn. We drank our coffee out of paper cups, and through the square ferry windows, he pointed out the dry docks and the skeletons of new submarines. Nice thing about it is, if there's a storm, you can submerge and it's quiet, sleep like a baby, and all hell will be busting loose up above, but not down below. He gave me directions for getting out of town, some of the few accurate ones I got on the whole trip. So long, I said. I hope you have a good future. It's not bad, you know. Goodbye, sir. And after driving along a back Connecticut road, tree bordered and gardened, I knew he had made me feel better and surer. For weeks, I had studied maps, large scale and small, but maps are not reality at all. They can be tyrants. I knew people who are so immersed in road maps that they never see the countryside they pass through, and others who, having traced a route, are held to it, as though held by flanged wheels to rails. I pulled Rocinante into a small picnic area maintained by the state of Connecticut and got out my book of maps. And suddenly the United States became huge beyond belief and impossible ever to cross. I wondered how in the heck I'd got myself mixed up in a project that couldn't be carried out. It was like starting to write a novel. When I faced the desolate impossibility of writing 500 pages, a sixth sense of failure falls on me, and I know I can never do it. And this happens every time. Then gradually, I write one page and then another. One day's work is all I can permit myself to contemplate, and I eliminate the possibility of ever finishing. So it was now. As I looked at the bright-colored projection of monster America, the leaves of the trees about the campground were thick and heavy, no longer growing, but hanging limp and waiting for the first frost to whip them with color, and the second to drive them to the earth and terminate their year. And this is coming to one of my favorite parts and one of my students' favorite parts right now. Charley is a tall dog. And as he sat in the seat beside me, his head was almost as high as mine. And he would put his nose close to my ear and say, "Pft." He is the only dog I ever knew who could pronounce the consonant F. This is because his front teeth are crooked, a tragedy which keeps him out of dog shows because his upper front teeth slightly engage his lower lip. Charley can pronounce F. The word "pft" usually means he would like to salute a bush or a tree. I opened the cab door and let him out, and he went about his ceremony. He doesn't have to think about it to do it well. It is my experience that in some areas, Charley is more intelligent than I am, but in others, he is abysmally ignorant. He can't read, he can't drive a car, and he has no grasp of mathematics. But in his own field of endeavor, which he was now practicing, the slow, imperial smelling over and anointing of an area, he has no peer. Of course, his horizons are limited, but how wide are mine? And we will end there on that beautiful, comedic, poetic description of his dog taking a pee. And we will end there today. Any thoughts or comments so far on our journey with Travels with Charleys?
Does it bring back our road trips?
This was, whoops, is this on?
That should be. Except it's on.
So this was written in the 50s, right?
He took the journey in 60, 61, and it came out in 62.
Okay. But there's been a lot of time in between, and it strikes me that he's thinking of himself more towards the end of his life than, and now at my advanced age, I think he's just starting. No, but I think there's been a difference in our perspective in that period of time since he wrote that.
Yeah. Yeah, that's something that always comes out in reading this is there, I mean, yeah, our mindset changes, our consciousness changes. And so it's good to look, because this is now, it's 60 years, actually. 62, yeah, it's 60 years since this, 59, almost 60 years since this book came out.
And we're living longer. We're
Yes, that's
living
right.
longer. Back in the 60s, if you were 70, it was sort of, but now we're living longer. That might, I don't know, that kind of figures in maybe.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, that's very true. I mean, with medicine, technology, and everything else, our life expectancy has gone up. Yep.
In the introduction, he said that he didn't write hot. You talked about how he wanted to think things over and through before he wrote, yet he took paper and carbon with him. How did he do some writing each day, or did he, things like this conversation certainly seemed fresh and not something he rethought a week later or a month later?
I caught some of that. Alan, could you give me more of the gist of that? I caught some of it.
So you said that he said he didn't write hot, that he brought carbon paper with him and took some notes. So I think what you're getting at, like,
Well, my question was, how often did he write? Did he wait a week and mull things over, or did he write some each day, or?
Yeah, so later in the book, he'll give a little hints about that without just talking about it specifically, but he'll talk about the notes that he has that he's taped to like vegetable cans so he doesn't lose them, or he's used a rubber band and tapes his notes to like different foodstuffs. So he was a kind of a writer that made little notes about conversations, maybe certain dialogue that he would write down. But I think he wrote most of this when he got back to Long Island and in his writing room, and then put it all out. So it was notes, memory, and everything else, which again, so in creative nonfiction, he went beyond creative nonfiction because he added other things when he thought the narrative needed it. But yeah, it was just notes, notebooks, little pieces of paper that he would rip out and then fasten to like vegetable cans, and then later on find those notes and write from them. So yeah, it's a good question too. Yeah.
So do you think that in some way helped him retain the spontaneity of the conversations?
Yeah, I think he added to a lot of the conversations and made them more interesting. But I think it just depends. Every writer has a different process. I use found objects everywhere, cardboard boxes, like, anything I can find when I'm out, I'll write on. So I have a collection of boxes of all the different things I've used, posters that I'll rip off of like telephone poles that I've written on over the years that will become stories or even work into books. But Steinbeck was a person who really needed to let it sit, and he really liked to have a special place like his writing room in his house that he would then sit down and write from. Joseph Campbell was actually very much like that too. He needed his ritual of sitting down at his desk with his books and his things that he had collected from his travels before he could write. So yeah, being a writer is a very interesting thing because everybody has their own unique process, and that's why when people when writing teachers try to make students write like them, it never works out. So I always just try to help my students to find their own process and their own way of writing that'll work for them, because eventually it'll just be them in their process and they won't be in school anymore. So Steve, you're muted. You have to unmute.
There we go, sorry. It kind of reminds us of the trips that we take and we look back months or years later and there's sort of a truth of the trip that wasn't really evident at the time, but kind of lives on with us. And you think about the things that maybe at the moment were important, but later on become really important parts of the trip. And so he's able to do that looking retrospectively.
Yeah, and you know, the thing is, I like the way that he, in the beginning, he says, you think you take the trip, but the trip takes you, right? And then years later, you thought you had learned everything that you had learned from the trip, but there's all these other things now that come flowing into you, right? And so it is like a relationship that continues even after you're done with what you thought was the main part of the relationship. There's all these other parts of the relationship that will come to you later on. So it's a beautiful thing to think about. Places like that too. You have a relationship with a place, and even when you leave it, it doesn't necessarily mean your relationship with it is gone, because you still keep it in memory and you still have it, you know, kind of lodged in you somewhere. Well, if there are no other thoughts or comments or questions for today,
Okay,
the
thank
book
you.
is really fun. It's really interesting. There's a lot of comedy in it, which is one reason that I like it. So we will continue on. He's right now he's starting to become fall in Connecticut. And we're going to go up through Connecticut into Vermont and Maine during the fall season and meet the Mainers, who he finds to be very interesting people.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. And thanks also for the viewers of the future for this recording. So have a great day, everyone, and we'll see you next time, Jake.
All right, take